I was on my way to the meeting about my wife's inheritance. Just as I started my car, a homeless man appeared. What seemed like a passing moment soon revealed itself as the beginning of something far greater, guiding me toward a path I never imagined. From that instant, events began weaving together in ways my family could never have foreseen, leading to a revelation still unfolding. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. The morning air was heavy with silence as I closed the door of my house behind me. It was the kind of silence that lingers after a loved one is gone, almost as if the walls themselves remember her laughter and the soft way she used to move through the rooms. My hands trembled slightly as I carried the folder of documents the lawyer had asked me to bring. Each paper inside was a reminder that my wife was no longer here to guide me through life's burdens. The driveway stretched before me. The car waited like a quiet vessel ready to take me into a future I did not entirely want. For a brief moment I paused, staring at the sky, whispering her name under my breath as though she might answer. The meeting was not about wealth to me. It was about closure, about finishing one of the last chapters she had left unwritten. Yet I knew my son and his wife had been circling like restless hawks. They were eager to hear what was left behind. They wanted numbers rather than memories, and that thought pressed upon me like an unseen weight. As I approached the car, lost in my own reflection, I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. A shadow rose from where the hedges met the street. Then I saw him, a man wrapped in tattered clothes, his beard unkempt, his eyes worn yet strangely steady. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He did not rush at me or frighten me. He simply stood there with a gentle nod, as though he had been waiting for me specifically. With a soft voice, he asked if I had a moment to spare. In that instant, the world seemed to split into two paths. One path was where I brushed him aside in my hurry to reach the lawyer. The other was where I chose to listen. What I decided would ripple far beyond that morning. I tightened my grip on the folder. The crisp sound of papers shifting inside reminded me of obligations. Yet something in the man's eyes held me. It whispered of struggles I had once known, struggles I had fought tooth and nail to overcome. My thoughts drifted backward in a flood. I remembered days when my wife and I had only a few coins between us. Hunger gnawed and cold nights felt endless. I remembered swearing that if we ever reached comfort, I would never forget those still left in the shadows. The man before me did not beg or dramatize his need. He simply asked for help, in a voice that carried both humility and dignity. Though I was on the cusp of one of the most important meetings of my life, I found myself reaching for the car keys more slowly. I hesitated as if waiting for a sign. The street was still. The air was heavy with the scent of morning dew. For reasons I could not yet explain, I felt my wife's presence in that moment. It was as though she were guiding my heart toward compassion rather than haste. I knew the meeting would be filled with tension. My son's impatient questions, my daughter-in-law's sharp remarks. Yet here before me was a chance to act not out of fear of their demands, but out of remembrance of the woman whose inheritance was at the center of it all. I looked at the man again. The edges of his suffering seemed to blur into something familiar. He looked like a reflection of what I could have become if life had tilted the other way. That morning, on the quiet street outside my home, the story began not in the lawyer's office, not in the arguments that would follow. It began right there in the exchange between a grieving old man and a stranger who reminded him that life's greatest legacies are not measured in money, but in the choices we make when kindness calls. After my wife passed away, The world seemed to fold in on itself, and every morning I woke to a silence that pressed against my chest like an invisible weight, reminding me that the woman who had been my partner through decades of laughter, arguments, sacrifices, and triumphs was no longer by my side. The bed felt too large, the kitchen too quiet. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder, as if time itself was mocking me with its persistence while I longed for it to stop, just for a moment, so I could catch my breath. People often say that time heals all wounds, but I found that time only reminded me of what I had lost, each sunrise a cruel repetition of absence. I wandered the house aimlessly, touching the objects she once held, the teacup she loved, the books she left scattered on the table, her favorite shawl, draped on the chair as though she would walk in any second to wrap it around her shoulders. Each corner of the house whispered her presence, yet her absence screamed louder, and the hollowness that followed her death made every decision feel unbearably heavy. Friends and relatives came with their condolences, offering words meant to comfort, but words cannot stitch back the fabric of a heart that has been torn in half. I smiled politely, nodded, and listened, yet inside I felt detached, as though they were speaking through a veil that separated me from the rest of the world. The inheritance they spoke of so casually felt less like a blessing and more like a burden. Money had never been the glue that held us together, and now, facing the fortune she left behind, I felt no excitement, only sorrow that I had to face it without her. At night, when the house grew still, I would sit in her chair by the window and stare at the stars, wondering if she could see me, wondering if she knew how lost I was without her. Sometimes I spoke aloud, telling her about my day, about the letters from the lawyer, about the tension brewing with our son and his wife. I imagined her smile, the way she would squeeze my hand and remind me that strength was built one small step at a time. Yet the only response was the soft creak of the house settling in the night air. In those moments, grief felt like a vast ocean, and I was a small boat drifting without sails, carried wherever the current of sorrow wanted to take me. I tried to find comfort in routine. I cooked meals, though I barely ate. I tended to the garden, though the flowers seemed dull without her gaze to admire them. I forced myself to shave and dress each morning, because I knew she would not want me to fall apart completely, yet every action felt mechanical, stripped of joy. The neighbors waved politely, some avoiding eye contact, unsure of how to speak to a man consumed by loss. I did not blame them. Grief is uncomfortable for those who watch from the outside, but for the one who bears it, grief is everything. A constant companion that sits beside you at breakfast, walks with you through the hallways, and crawls into bed with you at night. The inheritance papers sat on my desk like a silent challenge, reminding me that decisions awaited me, decisions she would have helped me make with her calm wisdom. Without her, I felt like a soldier on the battlefield with no commander, left to guess the strategy while the enemy closed in. The fortune that others saw as opportunity only deepened my sorrow, because wealth could not bring her back, nor could it fill the void that echoed inside me with every heartbeat. I thought of our wedding day, of the years we built together, of the sacrifices she made so our son could live with more comfort than we ever dreamed of in our youth. Each memory was both a blessing and a wound, comforting in its warmth but painful in its reminder that those days were gone. Life after her passing was not about living but about enduring, and each day I rose not out of desire but out of obligation to the promise I once made her, that I would carry on no matter how heavy the load became. Even before the day of the meeting, I could sense the shifting air around my son and his wife, for grief had barely settled into the corners of our home when their questions began to circle, sharp and persistent, like birds of prey waiting for the right moment to strike. And though they cloaked their inquiries with thin layers of concern, I could see the hunger in their eyes. A hunger, not for memories of the woman we had lost, but for the wealth she left behind. They would visit the house under the guise of checking on me, offering quick embraces that felt more rehearsed than heartfelt. And almost as soon as we sat down, they would turn the conversation to money. How much did the lawyer say? Did she leave clear instructions? Was the estate large? My son would ask with feigned curiosity, while his wife leaned forward, her smile tight, her hands clasped, as though holding back her impatience. At first, I tried to steer the talk toward stories of his mother, of the life she and I had built together, of the sacrifices that paved the way for the comforts he had enjoyed. But those moments of reflection were brushed aside, met with hurried nods and quick redirections back to figures and accounts. It stung more than I could admit, for I had hoped that in losing her, we might at least find unity. Yet what I found was a coldness in my own son's tone that reminded me not of family, but of a stranger conducting business. My daughter-in-law was less subtle. She would glance around the house, her eyes scanning as though each object was a token waiting to be priced. And once, when she thought I could not hear, I caught her whisper to him that old men could not handle large fortunes, that it would be better for them to take control before I made mistakes. The words struck deep, not because they questioned my ability, but because they dismissed the very essence of who I was, a man who had worked through sweat and pain to provide, a man who had stood beside his wife through years of struggle, only to have his worth measured in his age and dismissed as incompetence. Their presence filled the house with tension. The warmth that once greeted me at the door when my son visited had been replaced by a chill, a calculation behind every glance and smile. I could feel them waiting, watching, like a pair of accountants tallying numbers they did not yet own. And though I remained silent, inside I began to realize that the inheritance was less a blessing than a test, one that would reveal the true nature of those who claimed to love me. Nights grew harder, for I would lie awake not only grieving my wife but questioning the son I had raised, wondering if somewhere along the path I had failed to teach him the value of compassion over wealth, integrity over greed. I remembered the countless times his mother and I had gone without so he could have what he wanted, the late nights I spent working extra hours to pay for his schooling, the quiet determination with which she managed the household so that he never felt the pinch of poverty. And yet, now with her gone, all those sacrifices seemed invisible to him, overshadowed by the gleam of an inheritance he believed was his by right. The more they pressed, the heavier the burden became, until I felt as though I were carrying not only the weight of my wife's absence, but also the crushing disappointment of realizing that the love of my own child might have been replaced by a thirst for money. The lawyers' meeting loomed ahead, not just as a legal appointment but as a confrontation with truth, and though my heart ached with grief, another feeling began to stir quietly within me. The slow burn of resolve that perhaps her legacy would not be handed so easily to those who sought it without honor. As I stepped toward my car, the folder of documents pressed tightly against my chest. I felt the pull of memories and the looming weight of the meeting that awaited me. Yet, in that moment, my attention was drawn away by the sight of a man who stood a few steps from the curb, his figure slouched, his clothes worn and torn by time and hardship, his hands folded before him as though holding together the little dignity he had left. And though many might have turned their eyes away, I could not, for something about his presence demanded to be seen. His eyes, tired but not empty, met mine with a quiet steadiness that stirred something within me, a reminder of days long past when I too knew what it meant to walk with nothing but hope as a shield against the world. He raised his voice, just enough for me to hear, asking politely if I might spare a little help, his words carrying no arrogance, no entitlement, only the simple plea of a man who had been forgotten by many, yet still clung to the courage to ask. For a heartbeat I stood frozen, torn between the urgency of the inheritance meeting and the unspoken call in his eyes. And in that stillness, I felt the echo of my wife's voice, gentle and guiding, as though she whispered that kindness was never a delay, but a duty. The morning air seemed to hold its breath, the street quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic, and in that silence I studied him closer, noticing the patches on his coat, the way the cold air reddened his cheeks, the small tremor in his fingers as he clasped them together. It would have been easy to look past him, to climb into my car and drive away, telling myself that I had more pressing matters, that the inheritance meeting was the priority. Yet, deep in my heart, I knew that the true measure of the legacy my wife left behind was not in papers or numbers, but in the choices I made in her absence. The man reminded me of myself in a way that startled me, for I could see in him a reflection of the younger version of me, standing on the edge of despair, praying silently for someone to notice. I remembered nights when I counted coins on a table, hoping it would stretch enough for food, mornings when I swallowed pride to ask for work, afternoons when rejection pressed so hard it felt like the sky itself had closed above me. My wife had been the one who gave me strength, who held my hand and told me that dignity was not lost in poverty, that kindness often came from those who knew struggle firsthand. Looking at the man, I felt as though she were standing beside me again, urging me to honor not just her memory but the values we had shared. Slowly I loosened my grip on the car keys, letting the folder rest on the hood as I stepped toward him. His eyes flickered with surprise, as though he had expected dismissal, and I could almost hear the unspoken relief in his breath. He did not ask for much, only for a little help. But in that request I sensed a deeper story, one of battles fought in silence, of nights endured under unforgiving skies, of dreams worn thin, yet not entirely extinguished. I reached into my pocket, not for money at first, but for the sandwich I had packed for the road, wrapped carefully in paper, a small token meant to sustain me through the long day. I held it out, and his hands, trembling now not from cold but from gratitude, accepted it as though it were gold. The way he thanked me, quietly, sincerely, carried more weight than any fortune discussed in the offices of lawyers, and in that moment the world around us seemed to pause, leaving only two men bound by an invisible thread of shared humanity. I did not yet know the role he would play in the unfolding story, nor how this encounter would ripple through the choices I was about to make. But I felt something stirred deep within me, a quiet certainty that this was no accident, that perhaps fate had placed him there at the very doorway of my grief and duty, reminding me that sometimes the most important meetings are not the ones held in polished offices, but the ones that catch us by surprise, standing humbly at the edge of a driveway. As I watched the man clutch the sandwich with trembling hands, my mind drifted backward across the years, and before I knew it, the weight of memory pressed harder than the folder I carried. For I saw myself again as a young man with nothing but determination in his pockets, standing in the shadow of hardship and wondering how much longer we could endure. I remembered the narrow rooms we once rented, the the peeling wallpaper, the draft that crept through the windows on winter nights, and the way my wife and I huddled together under a single blanket, whispering promises that someday things would be better. Hunger was a familiar visitor then, and there were mornings when our stomachs growled louder than any alarm clock. Yet she would smile at me with a light in her eyes, telling me that love was nourishment too, and somehow those words gave me the strength to face another day. Work was never steady, and I took whatever I could find, hauling crates at the docks, sweeping floors at factories, patching roofs in the heat of summer. My hands blistered and calloused until they no longer felt like my own. Many nights I came home with nothing more than coins clinking in my palm, and she would stretch them into meals that somehow filled us, though often she gave me the larger share while claiming she was not hungry. A sacrifice I only understood years later when I saw how thin she had become. Those were the days when pride was a luxury we could not afford, when I swallowed it down and asked strangers for work, when rejection stung but survival mattered more. Yet, in that crucible of struggle, something within me hardened, a resolve that no matter how poor we were, no matter how difficult the climb, I would never let go of the dream that one day my family would stand on firmer ground. I remembered the rain-soaked boots that never dried, the shirts patched more times than I could count, the nights when illness threatened to undo all our efforts, and the mornings when exhaustion made my body ache as though it had been beaten. Through it all, she stood by me, never complaining, always reminding me that struggle was not a curse but a teacher, shaping us into people who would one day understand the true value of every coin earned. When our son was born, I felt both joy and fear. Joy for the life we had brought into the world, and fear for how I would provide for him, yet that fear became fuel, pushing me harder, making me accept longer hours and harsher work. Because I swore he would not grow up as we had. He would not know the gnawing hunger or the cold nights without fire. Those vows carried me through decades, through setbacks and small victories, through disappointments that cut deep, and through the rare triumphs that tasted sweeter because of the pain that had preceded them. Looking at the homeless man before me, I felt the sting of recognition, for his eyes mirrored the same desperation I had once carried, the same silent plea for a chance, and I wondered how different my story might have been had no one ever reached out a hand. My wife's parents once offered us shelter when we had nowhere else to go, and that single act of kindness became the spark that helped us rise again, a reminder that survival is never truly solitary. Now, decades later, standing on my driveway with documents that spoke of millions, I could still feel the echo of those hungry days, and I realized that the weight of inheritance was not only in wealth, but in the lessons carved deep into my bones. Struggle had been our foundation, and though it had nearly broken us at times, it had also given us strength beyond measure, the kind of strength that could not be bought or sold. My wife and I built everything brick by brick, dollar by dollar, sacrifice by sacrifice. And in those memories I found both pain and pride. Pain for what we endured, pride for how we endured it together. Those memories return to me now not as ghosts, but as guides, reminding me that the choices I made in the days ahead must honor not only her memory but also the long road we had walked to arrive here. I stood there for a moment longer, the folder still pressed against the hood of my car, and I looked again at the man who had appeared as if summoned by some unseen hand. His shoulders drawn tight against the morning chill, his eyes lowered in quiet gratitude as he held the sandwich I had offered him, and something in me softened in a way I had not felt since before my wife passed. As though a door had opened to remind me that kindness is never wasted, no matter how small it seems. I reached into the back seat of the car, and pulled out the old jacket that I often kept there, a heavy wool coat I had not worn since last winter, and without much thought, I extended it to him. His hesitation was brief, his pride flickering in his eyes before gratitude overcame it, and with trembling hands he slipped the jacket on, the sleeves a little long, but the warmth wrapping around him like a promise that he would face the day with at least one burden lifted. He looked at me with a smile so faint it might have been missed by anyone not paying attention, but to me it carried the weight of unspoken stories, of long nights endured, of battles fought in silence. I nodded, and for a heartbeat it felt as though my wife was standing beside me, her gentle voice reminding me that compassion is the truest legacy we leave behind. The man thanked me softly, words almost swallowed by the morning air, and I realized then that this brief moment, this exchange of food and warmth, was more meaningful than any conversation I might have with lawyers in sterile offices filled with polished wood and contracts. I remembered how often she had reminded me that wealth means nothing if it is not used to lift others, that the heart grows poor when it forgets the value of generosity. Standing there, I knew that in giving him something small, I had in truth received something greater, a reminder that even in grief, I was still capable of reaching beyond my sorrow to touch another life. He told me his name, a short and simple word, but I felt it anchor in my memory as though I might need it later. His voice carried traces of dignity, a hint of the man he once was before life's storms had stripped him down to the streets. I did not press him for his story, for I knew the pain that lives in unspoken details, and I understood that sometimes it is enough to be seen and acknowledged, to be treated not as invisible but as human. The morning sunlight broke through the clouds then, falling across us both, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, as though in that ordinary driveway I had stepped into something larger than myself, something guided by forces I could not see. He clutched the sandwich with care, as if it were a feast, and pulled the coat tighter around him, and I thought again of the nights when my wife and I had nothing but each other, and how a single act of kindness from someone else had helped us take another step forward. Life has a way of circling back, of offering us chances to repay debts we can never fully return. And in that moment, I felt as though I were paying forward the kindness that once saved me. I wished her voice could have been heard in that silence, for I knew she would have smiled and said, "Yes, this is what it means to honor me, not by clinging to wealth, but by carrying forward the compassion we built our lives upon." With a final nod, he thanked me again, and I told him to take care, my words plain but weighted with sincerity. As I climbed into the car and placed the folder on the passenger seat, I felt different, lighter somehow, as if I had just stepped onto a path I had not planned but was meant to follow. What awaited me at the lawyer's office was still ahead, the questions, the demands, the tension, but in that moment all that mattered was that a man who had been cold now had warmth, and a man who had been hungry now had food, and an old man who had been drowning in grief had been reminded that kindness can still breathe life into weary hearts. The drive to the lawyer's office was quiet, the hum of the engine a steady rhythm against the storm of thoughts in my head, and though the folder of documents sat beside me on the passenger seat like a constant reminder of the business ahead, my mind kept drifting to the man I had just met, his quiet dignity etched into my memory. Yet as the streets grew busier and the tall glass buildings rose before me, the reality of the meeting pressed harder against my chest, until I could almost feel my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the office building that loomed like a monument to wealth and power, the kind of place where numbers mattered more than stories, where signatures carried the weight of futures. My wife had been meticulous in planning, careful in every detail, and I knew that what awaited me inside was the unfolding of her final wishes. Yet the thought of facing it without her made my hands tremble as I reached for the folder. I walked into the lobby, the polished marble floor gleaming beneath my steps, the air filled with the faint scent of leather and paper, and the receptionist greeted me with polite efficiency before directing me to the conference room. As I approached, I could already hear the muffled voices of my son and daughter-in-law inside, sharp and hurried, like birds chattering over scraps, and my heart sank, because I knew their minds were not on her memory, but on the inheritance she left behind. I opened the door and stepped inside, and their eyes turned to me immediately, not with warmth or compassion, but with an impatient gleam, as though I were late to a transaction rather than early to a moment of closure. My son rose halfway from his seat before settling back down, his movements restless, his jaw tight, while his wife leaned back with her arms crossed, a thin smile on her lips that did not reach her eyes. The lawyer, an older man with kind but weary features, stood to shake my hand, his voice calm as he welcomed me. Yet I could sense even he felt the tension pressing against the walls of the room. I sat down at the long wooden table, the folder placed before me, and as the lawyer organized his papers, silence hung in the air for a moment, before my daughter-in-law broke it with a question that cut through like a knife. "How much are we talking about?" Her words were blunt, stripped of sensitivity, and though she tried to mask them with a laugh, the hunger in her tone was undeniable. My son shifted uncomfortably, but did not correct her, and instead he leaned forward and asked if the will was clear, if the division of assets had already been decided. I looked at them both, and for a fleeting second I searched for the boy I had raised, the child who once ran into my arms after school, the young man who had once spoken of dreams larger than money. But all I saw was a man clouded by expectation, and a woman whose ambition sharpened every word she spoke. The lawyer began to read, his voice steady, outlining the details of the estate, the investments, the properties, the accounts, each word falling heavy in the room. Yet instead of listening with reverence for her memory, they leaned forward eagerly, their eyes lighting up at each mention of value. I felt myself shrinking inside, grief twisting with disappointment. But I remained silent, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my mind torn between sorrow for my wife and the dawning realization that this meeting would not be about honoring her, but about protecting her legacy from being consumed by greed. The papers rustled, the lawyer continued, and I sat there, listening, grieving, and quietly preparing for the storm that was already gathering within these walls. The lawyer had barely finished reading the first section of the will when my daughter-in-law leaned forward, her eyes sharp and restless, and she said with a voice that left no room for subtlety that it was time to stop dancing around the numbers and reveal exactly how much money there was, as if my wife's life and death had been reduced to a balance sheet waiting to be tallied. My son nodded in agreement, his expression stern, his jaw clenched in a way that reminded me of the stubborn boy he once was, though now his stubbornness had turned into something colder, a hunger that made my chest ache. I sat quietly, my hands folded on the table, and I let their words echo in the room, words that struck not because of what they asked, but because of the timing, because grief still sat raw in my heart, while they pressed forward with questions that revealed no regard for the woman we had just buried. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and reminded them that these matters required patience, that everything would be explained in time, but they were not listening. They wanted control. They wanted figures. They wanted to know how soon the inheritance could be transferred. My daughter-in-law's voice grew sharper, accusing me of withholding information, as if I had already taken steps to keep them away from what she called their rightful share. I looked at her and wondered how someone could sit across from me, someone who had eaten at our table, someone whose wedding we had paid for, someone my wife had welcomed into the family with open arms, and yet now speak with such entitlement, as though everything belonged to her. My son avoided my eyes, staring instead at the document spread across the table, his fingers tapping impatiently against the wood, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the same chill as hers. He asked me how I planned to divide the estate, as though the decision was his to make, as though the years his mother and I had spent building every brick of that fortune were nothing more than a prelude to his claim. I wanted to remind him of the nights I had worked until my body ached, of the sacrifices his mother had made, of the dreams we had postponed so he could have what he wanted, but the words stuck in my throat because I knew they would fall on deaf ears. The lawyer tried again to steady the room, his calm tone urging respect. But my daughter-in-law laughed, a short sound that carried no joy, and she said that I was too old to handle such responsibility, that it would be wiser to let them manage it before I wasted it on causes that no longer mattered. The insult hung in the air, heavy and cruel. And though my son did not repeat her words, his silence confirmed his agreement. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not from anger alone, but from the sharp pain of betrayal, the realization that the child I had raised with love and devotion now saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle standing in the way of wealth. For a long moment I said nothing, choosing instead to watch them, to let their demands fill the room, because in their eagerness they revealed themselves more clearly than any confession could. Their words were daggers, cutting away the thin veil of civility, exposing a greed that had grown unchecked, and in that revelation I felt something within me shift. I thought of my wife, of her gentle wisdom, of how she would have wanted me to handle this moment not with rashness but with resolve, and I knew then that their demands, no matter how loud, would not be the deciding force in this story. Still, I sat there quietly, letting them believe that they had the upper hand, while deep inside a plan began to take shape, a plan born not of spite, but of the need to protect her legacy from those who saw only numbers where love should have been. As their voices filled the room with questions about accounts and assets, I felt myself drift away for a moment, my gaze falling not on the lawyer's papers but on the polished surface of the table where my reflection wavered. And in that reflection I saw not the man sitting there now, but the younger version of myself, the one who had once stood at the threshold of life with nothing but determination in his heart, and a woman beside him who believed in him when no one else did. I remembered the long nights when we counted coins by candlelight, stretching them as far as they would go, and how my wife always managed to make the smallest of meals feel like feasts simply by filling them with her laughter. I remembered the back-breaking work, the endless hours in factories, the days I came home drenched in sweat and dust, my hands calloused and aching, yet she welcomed me with a smile and a kiss on the forehead that told me every struggle was worth it. We sacrificed vacations, new clothes, and comforts that others took for granted, because every dollar had to be saved for the dream we held close, the dream of giving our son a life untouched by the hunger and hardship we had known. I remembered the night she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook, writing down expenses, cutting corners where she could, never once complaining, though I could see the tiredness in her eyes. When opportunities for overtime came, I took them without hesitation, working long past the point of exhaustion, because I knew every extra hour meant another brick in the foundation of the life we were building. She stood by me always, never wavering, never doubting, even when I doubted myself. And together we built not just a home, but a life layered with perseverance and sacrifice. There were moments when we argued, moments when the pressure felt unbearable, but even in those moments our love grew stronger, forged in the fires of hardship. I remembered the first time we had enough saved for a down payment on a house, the way she cried tears of joy, holding the keys like they were treasures, her hands shaking with disbelief that the years of struggle had led us there. I remembered how we sacrificed again to pay for our son's education, how we chose to drive old cars and wear worn shoes so that he could have the best we could offer, how she skipped meals quietly so he never went hungry, and how we both agreed that every sacrifice was worth it if it meant he would grow up never knowing the bitterness of poverty. It was not wealth handed to us. It was not luck. It was sacrifice, the kind that wears you down slowly but builds you up in ways that cannot be measured by numbers. And yet here I was, sitting at a table, where my son and his wife demanded answers with cold eyes, as if the years of sacrifice that had built this inheritance were invisible to them, as if the fortune was theirs by birthright, rather than the result of decades of toil. The memories poured through me like a river, flooding me with both pride and sorrow. For though I would never regret a single sacrifice made for my family, I could not help but feel the sting of disappointment that those sacrifices were now forgotten, dismissed, or worse, taken for granted. Still, as I sat there in silence, I realized that those memories were my strength, that the sacrifices we made had not been in vain, because they had given me the resolve to protect what we had built, not for greed, but for honor, not for selfish gain, but for the promise I had once made her that her legacy would never be squandered by those who could not see the value of the love and labor that created it. As the lawyer continued to read through the details of the estate, I could feel the impatience in the air thickening like smoke. And then my daughter-in-law leaned forward, her eyes fixed on me with a sharpness that made it clear she no longer intended to mask her thoughts behind polite words. And with a voice that carried both scorn and mockery, she said that I was too old to handle so much money, that men like me often wasted fortunes on foolish causes, or let it sit unused, while the younger generation stood ready to put it to better use. Her words stung not because they were true, but because of the complete disregard they showed for the decades I had spent working and sacrificing to create the very wealth she now coveted. And as she spoke, I thought of my wife, of how she had welcomed this woman into our family with warmth and kindness, never suspecting that one day she would look at me not as a father figure, but as an obstacle to be removed. I looked at my son, hoping for even the smallest flicker of defense, some protest to remind me that the boy I raised was still inside him. But he sat in silence, his lips pressed together, his eyes lowered to the documents as though the ink on the page mattered more than the insult hurled at his own father. My daughter-in-law smirked slightly, satisfied with her boldness, and she pressed further, saying that it would be wiser if I signed over control of the estate to them immediately, before I made poor decisions that would reduce the value of what she clearly considered her inheritance. The lawyer cleared his throat and tried to maintain order, reminding her that the will was clear and that my wife's wishes were to be honored, but she waved him off as though his words were little more than an inconvenience, and turned her sharp gaze back to me, daring me to argue with her. Inside me, grief twisted into something harder, a slow-burning anger mixed with disappointment so deep it threatened to drown me. Yet I forced myself to remain calm, because I knew that to meet her scorn with fury would only give her more power. I thought again of the sacrifices my wife and I had made, the long hours, the countless nights of worry, the choices that cost us comfort but gave our son a chance at a better life. And here was his wife, mocking all of it, reducing a lifetime of effort to nothing more than numbers on paper. My hands tightened on the armrests of the chair, my breath steady, and though I said nothing, I knew she could see in my eyes that her words had not broken me. She leaned back then, crossing her arms, her smile triumphant, as though she had made her point, but what she did not realize was that with every word she had revealed herself, laying bare her greed and her contempt, and that revelation was all I needed to confirm what had already been growing in my heart. My son may have chosen silence, but his silence was as loud as her scorn. And together they painted a picture of people who saw me not as a father, not as the grieving husband of the woman we had all lost, but as a gatekeeper, to be pushed aside. I wanted to speak, to tell them that money earned through sacrifice is not theirs to claim simply because they believe they deserve it. But I held my tongue, choosing instead to let them speak, to let their own words condemn them. Because I knew the time would come when I would reveal the truth, and when that time came, their scorn would turn into silence. For now, I sat still, the image of my wife steady in my mind, her voice reminding me that patience was often the sharpest blade, and though her absence cut me deeply, her memory gave me the strength to endure their mockery without surrendering to it. Her words lingered in the air like a bitter taste, and my son's silence only made them sharper. And in that moment, something inside me began to shift, not with rage that burned hot and wild, but with a cold clarity that settled deep in my bones, the kind of clarity that comes when a man has been pushed to the very edge of patience and sees the truth without any illusions left to soften it. For years I had given. I had sacrificed. I had bent myself into shapes that provided comfort and security for my family, believing that love and loyalty were the natural returns on such devotion. But sitting there in that room, with their greedy eyes fixed on me, I realized that love had been replaced with expectation, and loyalty had been traded for entitlement. The lawyer's voice droned on, filling the space with legal terms and figures, but all I could hear was the echo of my daughter-in-law's scorn and the hollow weight of my son's silence. My wife's memory seemed to rise around me then, her gentle presence, a steady hand on my shoulder, urging me not to crumble beneath their contempt, but to stand firm, to honor the years we had built together and the values we had lived by. I thought of the nights she and I whispered our dreams for the future, of the promises we made that our sacrifices would never be in vain. And I knew that allowing these two to claim her legacy with such arrogance would be a betrayal not only of her memory, but of everything we had endured. My daughter-in-law leaned forward again, her tone sharper now, pressing me to answer, demanding that I stop wasting time and make the decision to hand control over to them. And still, my son sat beside her, his silence no longer the restraint of a respectful man, but the complicity of someone who had chosen greed over family. That was the moment it happened, the breaking point, when the grief that had weighed me down was overtaken by a resolve that lifted me higher, and I knew then that I could no longer remain passive. I sat straighter in my chair, my eyes steady as I looked from her to him, and though my voice was calm, it carried the weight of decades, the authority of a man who had built everything with his own hands. I told them that their demands had been heard, that their impatience was clear, but that they were mistaken if they believed for even a moment that I would surrender my wife's legacy to their careless hunger. The room grew quiet, the lawyer pausing as he sensed the shift in my tone, and for the first time my son's eyes met mine, a flicker of surprise breaking through his mask of detachment. My daughter-in-law scoffed, rolling her eyes as though I were a stubborn old man clinging to pride, but I did not waver. I felt the strength of my wife in that moment, the years of struggle that had shaped us, the sacrifices that had defined us, and I knew that no insult, no demand, no silence could move me from the decision that had formed solid in my heart. The breaking point was not about anger, it was about clarity. It was the moment I understood fully that they would not protect what we had built, that they would squander it, and that I alone carried the responsibility of ensuring her memory was honored. My silence ended there, replaced by the firm resolve of a man who had endured too much to be dismissed. And though they did not yet realize it, that was the moment the story turned, the moment when everything they expected to gain began slipping quietly from their grasp. After that moment of clarity, I sat back in my chair with a stillness that belied the storm inside me, and while my son and his wife exchanged impatient glances, believing I had been shaken or silenced, I knew something they did not, that my mind had already begun to weave a plan, quiet and deliberate, one that would secure my wife's legacy beyond the reach of their greedy hands. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued reading, his voice steady but cautious, as if he sensed the tension in the room. Yet even as he spoke of properties, accounts, and investments, I was no longer listening only to him. I was listening to the echo of my wife's voice, the memory of her reminding me that wealth is not just about money, but about responsibility, about using what we built not to feed greed but to preserve dignity and to extend kindness. I thought of the way her eyes sparkled whenever she spoke of helping others, of creating something lasting, and I realized that this was my chance to honor her not with words, but with action. My plan began to take shape with each beat of my heart. I would not confront my son and his wife with open defiance just yet, for their greed was too loud to hear reason, and I needed time to move in silence. Instead, I would meet privately with the lawyer, a man I trusted, a man who had known my wife's wishes, and together we would build walls around her legacy so high and so firm that no amount of shouting or demanding could bring them down. Trusts, foundations, protections, written in legal ink that would place every penny of her inheritance where it belonged, beyond the reach of those who saw it only as a prize to be claimed. I sat there, nodding faintly, as if in agreement with their impatient chatter, letting them believe that their words carried weight. But inside, I felt the calm strength of a man who had already decided that their hands would never touch what we had built. The beauty of the plan was in its secrecy, for while they pressed me for decisions, I remained outwardly indecisive, a grieving old man who seemed hesitant and unsure, when in truth, I was already moving pieces on a board they could not even see. I would let them talk. I would let them demand. I would let them reveal every layer of their greed, because the more they showed their true selves, the more resolute I became. That night, after the meeting, I knew I would sit with the lawyer in private, and we would craft documents that safeguarded the inheritance in ways they could not challenge, locking it into places where it could grow and serve purposes greater than their selfish desires. I imagined the look on their faces when they realized the fortune was not theirs to claim, when they discovered that their scorn and demands had only pushed me to act more swiftly and more decisively. The thought gave me a strength I had not felt since before my wife passed, a sense of purpose that filled the hollowness of grief with something steady. My hidden plan was not born of vengeance, but of love. Love for the woman who had stood by me through every trial, love for the life we had built, and love for the idea that our sacrifices would mean something beyond ourselves. I sat quietly in that room, letting them misinterpret my silence, and while they mistook it for weakness, it was in truth the sound of resolve hardening the quiet preparation of a man who would not allow the legacy of his wife to be stolen or squandered. In the days that followed the meeting, I carried myself with the same quiet demeanor, walking through my home as though nothing had changed, answering my son's calls with calm words, listening to my daughter-in-law's thinly veiled suggestions with nods that gave nothing away. But beneath that surface of stillness, every hour was spent laying the foundation of the plan that would shield my wife's legacy from their hands. I rose early in the mornings, the house still cloaked in silence, and I would sit at my desk with the folder of documents spread before me, reviewing every line, every account, every property, reminding myself of the decades of labor and sacrifice that had created them. Each number was not simply wealth, it was a memory. The down payment on our first home, the tuition bills that carried our son through school, the nights of overtime that carved lines into my face, my wife's steady hand balancing ledgers at the kitchen table. These memories steeled me as I prepared for the steps I needed to take. The lawyer met with me privately, his expression respectful, his tone understanding, and together we began to design the structures that would lock away the inheritance in places they could not reach. We spoke of trusts, of foundations, of charitable funds that would honor my wife's compassion. Every detail was planned with precision. I asked questions slowly, carefully, because I wanted to understand how each decision would echo long after I was gone. The lawyer explained patiently, guiding me through possibilities, and with every answer my resolve grew stronger. I left his office with papers tucked under my arm and a sense of purpose in my chest that I had not felt since before my wife passed. At home, I moved quietly, never letting my son suspect the work being done behind the scenes. When he visited, I listened to his impatient words, his careful attempts to probe for information, and I gave him nothing but vague responses, as though I were still weighing my options. When his wife called, her voice sharp with questions, I let her believe I was hesitant, too tired, perhaps even confused, and in her arrogance she assumed I would eventually give in. They mistook my silence for weakness, but silence was my weapon, for every day that passed brought another signature, another seal, another layer of protection that removed the inheritance from their grasp. Alone in my study at night, I worked slowly and methodically, signing documents by lamplight, feeling the weight of each decision but also the strength of knowing I was honoring my wife. I would sometimes pause and look at her photograph on the desk, whispering that I was keeping my promise, that no matter how strong the pressure grew, I would not falter. Her smile in that photo seemed to give me strength, her eyes reminding me that love was not measured by what we held, but by what we gave. The silent preparation became my purpose. The grief that had once threatened to consume me was now channeled into action, every step forward a way of keeping her alive in the choices I made. My son and his wife continued to circle, calling more often, visiting more frequently, their words coated with false concern but driven by impatience, and I let them speak, offering them tea, listening quietly, nodding at their suggestions, all while knowing that behind the curtain of my silence, their ambitions were unraveling. Each day I carried out my work with steady hands, aware that the time would come when the truth would be revealed. And when that day arrived, their shock would be great, because while they saw only an old man they believed they could pressure, what they did not see was the quiet determination of a husband protecting the last gift his wife had left behind. It was only a matter of time before my silence began to gnaw at them, and one evening my son arrived at the house without warning, his footsteps heavy on the porch, his knock sharper than usual. And when I opened the door, I could see in his eyes that patience had finally run out, replaced with a fire that was not born of love or duty, but of desperation and greed. He barely greeted me before stepping inside, pacing the living room as though he owned it, his hands clenching and unclenching, his jaw tight. And when he finally spoke, his words struck me with the force of a hammer. He said he was tired of waiting, tired of my hesitations, and that it was time I handed over control of the inheritance. He did not ask. He demanded. His voice was cold, steady, and though I had once heard that same tone when he was a child begging for something he wanted, this time it was not the voice of a boy, but of a man who believed he had the right to command his father. I sat in my chair, the same chair where I had spent many nights with his mother by my side, and I listened without interrupting. Though inside I felt the weight of disappointment pressing against me with every word he spoke. He told me that if I refused, he would walk away, that he would not waste his life waiting for an old man to make decisions, that he had his own future to think about, and that my grief was blinding me to what was practical. The words cut deeper than he realized, for they carried not only a demand, but a threat, the threat of abandoning me in my final years if I did not comply. My chest tightened, not from fear of his ultimatum, but from the sorrow of realizing how far he had drifted from the boy I once carried on my shoulders, the boy who once looked at me with admiration, the boy whose every need I had sacrificed to meet. I looked at him as he stood there, his arms folded, his eyes sharp, and I wondered when love had turned into leverage, when respect had turned into entitlement. He said his wife agreed with him, that together they were prepared to take responsibility, and he painted a picture of a future where they managed everything while I faded quietly into the background, no longer burdened with the details of money and property. It was meant to sound practical, even caring, but I could hear the truth beneath the words, the hunger that drove them, the impatience that had now turned into threat. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply listened, my silence filling the space between us, and perhaps it unsettled him because his voice grew louder, his tone sharper, until finally he said that if I refused one more time, I would never see him again, that he was done waiting. My heart ached at the cruelty of those words, but instead of breaking me, they steadied me. For I understood now without doubt that I was no longer speaking to my son, but to a man who had been consumed by greed. In that moment, the ultimatum became not a threat but a gift, because it confirmed everything I needed to know. It showed me that my plan was not only necessary but urgent. I let him finish, his anger spilling into the room, and when he finally fell silent, I met his gaze and told him calmly that I had heard his words, that I understood his stance, but that I would not be pressured into decisions by threats or ultimatums. His face hardened, his eyes narrowing, and without another word, he turned and left the house, the door slamming behind him, leaving me alone in the quiet once more. Yet, I was not shaken. I was resolute. For in his ultimatum, he had given me the final proof that my wife's legacy must be protected, not only from him, but from the blindness that greed had cast over him. And I knew the day was near when he would learn the truth. The day of the final meeting arrived, and as I walked once more into the lawyer's office, the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressed firmly against me. Yet beneath that weight was a calm certainty, for I knew what I was about to say would change everything, and that their greedy expectations would collapse in an instant. My son and his wife were already seated at the long table, their faces tight with anticipation, their eyes sharp and restless as though they had been waiting for hours, eager to finally hear that the inheritance was theirs to control. The lawyer greeted me with a nod, his gaze steady, and I could sense that he understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. I sat slowly, my hands resting on the table, and for a long moment I simply looked at them, my son shifting uncomfortably under my gaze. His wife smirking with that same condescension she had carried since the beginning, as though the outcome was already decided in her favor. The lawyer began to speak, his voice calm, outlining once again the details of the estate, the accounts, the properties, but then he paused, his eyes meeting mine, waiting for the signal, and I gave a small nod. He cleared his throat and continued, his words now carrying the force of every decision I had made in secret. He explained that the inheritance had already been secured into trusts, that charitable foundations had been established in my wife's name, that protections had been written so firmly into law that no court could undo them, and that the wealth they had been circling for like vultures was no longer within their grasp. The room fell into silence, broken only by the sound of my daughter-in-law's sharp intake of breath as her smirk vanished, her eyes widening in disbelief. My son leaned forward, his face flushing with anger, his voice rising as he demanded an explanation, asking how I could do such a thing, but I did not flinch. I told him calmly that his mother's legacy was not meant to be squandered, that it was built through sacrifice, through decades of labor, through love and perseverance, and that I would not allow it to be reduced to a mere prize for those who could not honor what it truly meant. His wife erupted, her words bitter, accusing me of betrayal, saying I had no right, but I met her fury with silence, my eyes steady, letting her anger crash against me like waves against stone. My son's voice cracked as he shouted that he was my only child, that he deserved it, that I had no right to lock him out. And I answered him with the truth he did not want to hear. That inheritance is not about deserving, but about responsibility. That love and respect weigh heavier than blood when greed poisons the heart. The lawyer sat quietly, his hands folded, watching as the storm broke across the table, and I felt a strange calm within me, as though my wife's hand was resting gently on mine, guiding me through the chaos. My son pounded his fist on the table, his face red, his wife's voice rising beside him, but the decision was already sealed, the documents signed, the legacy secured. I told them plainly that what had been done was final, that they could shout, argue, and rage, but nothing would change the fact that their hunger had revealed who they were, and because of that, I had acted to protect what their mother had left behind. Their eyes burned with fury, their voices clashing, but to me it sounded distant, as though I were listening from another room, and all I could feel was the quiet satisfaction of a man who had stood firm. In that moment, the reveal was complete, and though they did not yet realize it, their grasping hands had already lost everything. The words from the lawyer seemed to hang in the air long after they were spoken, and I watched as the reality of what had been done began to sink into the faces of my son and his wife, their expressions shifting from disbelief to anger to something that almost resembled fear, as though the ground beneath them had been pulled away and they were left standing with nothing to hold. My daughter-in-law was the first to break the silence, her voice sharp, her tone edged with desperation as she insisted there must be some mistake, that no father in his right mind would lock his only son out of an inheritance of such size, and she demanded that the lawyer correct himself. But the lawyer, steady and unshaken, repeated that the documents were final, signed, sealed, and beyond dispute. My son's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, his eyes darting across the words, searching for some loophole, some oversight, but each line only confirmed the truth. The inheritance was secured, placed beyond his control, directed into trusts and causes that carried my wife's name, written with such precision that no challenge could unravel them. His face turned red, the veins on his neck straining as he glared at me, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked between fury and disbelief. He asked me how I could do this to him, how I could betray him in such a way, as if my duty as a father was to hand him everything without question. His wife slammed her hand on the table, her eyes burning with rage, accusing me of selfishness, of cruelty, of clinging to power out of spite. I sat quietly, letting their anger pour out, my silence steady, and though the storm of their words crashed against me, I felt no regret. What I felt was sorrow that it had come to this. Sorrow that the people I had once believed would carry forward the values my wife and I had lived by had revealed themselves so clearly consumed by greed. The shock on their faces was not only from the loss of wealth, but from the realization that they had underestimated me, that the old man they thought they could manipulate had been watching, listening, and preparing all along. My son's voice grew louder, almost shouting, his fists clenched as he accused me of caring more about strangers than about my own blood, and though his words were meant to wound, I saw in them the truth of his heart, that love had been replaced by entitlement long before this day. The lawyer raised his hand, reminding them once again that the decisions had been mine alone and that his office had simply carried out my instructions, but they barely heard him, their fury drowning out reason. My daughter-in-law's eyes glistened with angry tears as she whispered that they had counted on this money, that their future depended on it, and for a brief moment I almost pitied her. But then I remembered the scorn in her voice when she mocked me as too old, and I let the pity pass. My son leaned forward, his face inches from mine, his voice low and bitter as he swore that I would regret this. But I met his eyes without flinching, my voice calm, as I told him that the only regret I carried was that he had turned his back on the values his mother had lived for. The room grew heavy with silence after that, the shock of finality pressing against them, and though they tried to mask it with anger, I could see it in their eyes, the dawning awareness that they had lost, not by accident, not by miscalculation, but because I had chosen to act, because I had decided that love and sacrifice would not be squandered on greed. In that moment, the shock was complete. And while they sat stunned in their disappointment, I felt the quiet strength of a man who had protected what mattered most. After the storm of that meeting and the weight of my son's fury still ringing in my ears, I left the office with a strange mixture of exhaustion and peace. For though their anger had cut deep, my resolve was unbroken, and I felt as though I had done what my wife would have wanted. Days passed quietly, the house echoing with the same heavy silence that had become my companion. Yet there was also something new, a steady calm that came from knowing her legacy was secure. One afternoon, as I walked through the familiar streets of town, my thoughts turned unexpectedly to the man I had met on the morning of the first meeting, the homeless stranger who had stood humbly at the edge of my driveway, and I wondered if he was still nearby, or if life had carried him onward to other corners of the city. Almost as though summoned by memory itself, I saw him again, sitting on a bench near the park, the same worn jacket wrapped around him, the one I had given, his shoulders hunched, but his gaze lifted toward the passing clouds. I approached slowly, and when he noticed me, his face lit with a spark of recognition, his smile faint but sincere. And in that small expression, I felt a warmth that no amount of wealth could buy. I greeted him and asked how he had been, and he told me with quiet honesty that life was still difficult, but that he was grateful for the meal and the jacket, that in a world where most people turned away without a word, My kindness had reminded him that he was still seen. His words struck me deeply, for they echoed the very lesson my wife had always carried in her heart, that the greatest wealth lies in how we care for one another, not in what we hoard. I sat beside him on the bench, the afternoon sun filtering through the branches, and for a while we simply talked, not of money or loss, but of life, of struggles, of dreams once held and paths taken. He told me fragments of his story, not in detail but in glimpses, enough to reveal that he too had known better days, that misfortune and circumstance had chipped away at what he once had, leaving him here, overlooked by most, but still carrying a quiet dignity. I listened, truly listened, and as I did, I felt the weight of the inheritance not as a burden but as an opportunity, a chance to extend my wife's kindness into the world in ways that would last beyond me. I told him that I had made arrangements, that foundations had been created in her name, and that people like him, people who needed not pity but a chance, would be among those it sought to help. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment he seemed unsure if he had heard me correctly. But when he realized, I spoke with sincerity. Tears welled in his eyes, not of weakness, but of gratitude too deep for words. I placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that my wife had always believed in lifting others, that she would have wanted her legacy to touch lives such as his, and that in helping him, I was in truth honoring her. The bench grew quiet after that, the noise of the city a distant hum, and in that stillness I felt her presence again, as though she were smiling at the sight of me choosing compassion over resentment. When we parted, he thanked me again, not with flowery words, but with a look that carried more meaning than speech, and as I walked away, I realized that this encounter was no accident, that his return was a reminder that I was on the right path. My son and his wife might rage over what they lost, but here was a man who had gained something far greater, not just in material help, but in the restoration of dignity. And in that realization, I felt peace, knowing that through him and through countless others who would one day benefit, my wife's spirit lived on, her kindness continuing to ripple outward long after her voice had fallen silent. It was at a family gathering not long after the meeting that the truth of everything finally came to light, and though I had prepared myself for the storm, I could never have imagined how swiftly whispers would spread once the veil was lifted. Relatives filled the house with the usual murmur of voices, plates clattering in the kitchen, the smell of food hanging in the air. But beneath the warmth of the occasion there was an undercurrent of curiosity, for many had already heard fragments of what had taken place at the lawyer's office, and they were eager to know the truth. My son and his wife arrived late, their faces tight, their smiles forced, and it was clear they were already on edge, aware that their behavior was about to be revealed to a room full of eyes that had once admired them. For a while I kept to myself, greeting cousins and nephews, accepting embraces from nieces, but I could feel the anticipation in the air growing heavier, as though everyone was waiting for me to speak. At last, when the room had grown quiet, I stood and cleared my throat, my hand resting on the back of the chair for steadiness, and I began to speak, not with anger, but with the calm resolve of a man who had carried a burden and was ready to set it down. I told them all that my wife's inheritance had been secured, that it had been placed into trusts and foundations that would honor her name, and that it was no longer within the reach of those who had seen it only as wealth to be seized. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd, murmurs rising and falling, and then I went further, explaining that I had done so because I had witnessed something painful, The eagerness of my own son and his wife to treat her legacy as if it were a prize to be divided rather than a memory to be cherished. My voice did not rise, but each word carried the weight of truth, and I saw the color drain from their faces as the eyes of family members turned toward them, questioning, doubting, judging. My daughter-in-law tried to interrupt, her words stumbling as she insisted I was exaggerating. But the silence in the room swallowed her protests, for everyone could see in her eyes that she was guilty of exactly what I described. My son shifted in his chair, his jaw tight, his hands restless, but he did not speak, and his silence was louder than any defense could have been. I told them that my wife had always believed in kindness, that she had always wanted her legacy to reach beyond our walls, and that it was my duty to ensure her wishes were honored, even if it meant standing against my own blood. Gasps and nods moved through the room, and I could feel the tide of opinion shifting. Relatives who had once looked at my son with admiration now looking at him with disappointment, and my daughter-in-law's forced smile crumbling under the weight of disapproval. The exposure was complete, not through anger or vengeance, but through the simple act of truth spoken aloud, and in that moment their arrogance collapsed. My wife's sister stood and placed a hand on my shoulder. Her eyes filled with tears, and she said softly that my wife would have been proud, that I had done the right thing. Around us, relatives began to murmur words of agreement, voices rising in support, while my son and his wife sat frozen, unable to find footing in the flood of judgment. They had expected secrecy, that their hunger would remain hidden within the walls of the lawyer's office. But now it was laid bare, and in the light of family they could no longer pretend. I sat back down slowly, my heart heavy but steady. For though it pained me to expose my own son, I knew it was necessary. And as the gathering continued with awkward silences and shifting gazes, I felt the quiet strength of knowing that the truth had been spoken and that her legacy was safe not only in law but in the eyes of those who mattered most. In the days after the family gathering, the weight of truth settled heavily upon my son and his wife. And though they had walked into that house with heads held high and voices sharp with expectation, they left with shoulders slumped, their arrogance stripped bare under the gaze of relatives who now saw them, not as victims of circumstance, but as architects of their own shame. Word spread quickly, as it often does within families, and soon cousins, uncles, aunts, and even old friends who had been close to my wife all spoke quietly of what had been revealed, their voices tinged with disappointment at the greed that had been exposed. No longer were their names spoken with admiration. No longer were they seen as the young couple stepping into responsibility, but instead as the pair who had tried to wrest control of a legacy that was never theirs to claim. Invitations to gatherings grew fewer, conversations shortened, and when they walked into a room, the smiles they once received were replaced with guarded glances, whispers following them like shadows. My daughter-in-law, once so quick to laugh loudly and dominate conversations, now avoided eye contact, her voice softer, her confidence fractured by the judgment she could not escape. My son grew quiet, his usual pride diminished, and though he still carried himself with a stiffness that suggested defiance, I could see in his eyes the cracks forming, the slow realization that he had lost not only the inheritance, but also the respect of those around him. They tried at first to defend themselves, to spin the story into one of misunderstanding, but the truth had already taken root, and no words could undo what everyone had seen and heard. Relatives reminded one another of the sacrifices my wife and I had made, of the years of struggle that had built the fortune, and in that context, the greed of my son and his wife appeared even more stark, even more unforgivable. Slowly, The circle that once embraced them began to close, leaving them standing on the outside, their arrogance no longer a shield but a weight dragging them down. I watched this unfold with a heavy heart, not gloating, for a father does not rejoice in the downfall of his child, but with a solemn understanding that arrogance, when left unchecked, must eventually collapse under its own weight. My wife had always said that truth reveals itself in time, and as I saw the way relatives distanced themselves, how trust in my son eroded day by day, I realized she had been right once again. My son's voice, once so loud in the room demanding his share, grew hesitant when he spoke to me, his calls fewer, his visits rare, as though he could not face me without being reminded of the choices he had made. His wife remained bitter, her words sharp in private from what I was told, but in public she wore a mask of quiet compliance, no longer daring to scorn openly when so many eyes now judged her. Their arrogance had fallen, crumbling into the dust of their own making, and though it pained me to see them suffer the sting of shame, I knew it was the only way they might one day learn. The inheritance had been protected, the legacy secured, but what remained was the lesson that love and respect cannot be demanded. They must be earned, and arrogance destroys both. I thought often of my wife during those days, of how she would have handled it with grace, perhaps even forgiveness, and though I carried her wisdom with me, I also knew that the fall they were enduring was not mine to soften. It was theirs to bear, the consequence of their own choices, and as I sat alone in the quiet of our home, I prayed not that they would regain wealth, but that they would one day regain humility, for without it, they would never truly rise again. Now that the storm has passed and the dust of confrontation has settled, I sit alone in the quiet of my home and reflect on everything that has taken place. And though grief still lingers like a shadow in every room, there is also a peace that steadies me, for I know that I have done what needed to be done to protect the legacy of the woman who gave my life its purpose. My wife's photograph rests on the desk before me, her smile frozen in time, and I speak to her often as though she were still here, telling her about the steps I have taken, about the anger of our son, about the shame that has followed him and his wife. And though no words come back to me, I imagine her voice assuring me that I have done well. I think of the decades we spent together, of the sacrifices we made, of the nights we held each other when the world felt too heavy, and I realize that what we built was never about money alone, but about love, perseverance, and kindness. That is why I chose to secure the inheritance in ways that honored her memory, why I refused to surrender it to greed, why I placed it where it could do good long after both of us are gone. My son may see this as betrayal. My daughter-in-law may call it selfishness, but I know the truth. This was not about denying them wealth. It was about ensuring that the fortune born of sacrifice was not squandered on those who could not respect it. In time, perhaps they will understand, though I no longer hold my breath for that day. What I do hold on to is the knowledge that my wife's name will live on, etched into the foundations and trusts that will help those who need it most, like the man who appeared on my driveway that morning, a reminder that dignity can be restored through small acts of kindness. His return, his gratitude, showed me that even the smallest gesture can ripple outward, and I believe she sent him to remind me of the path we had always walked together. When I think of the anger in my son's eyes, the scorn in his wife's words, I feel sorrow but not regret. A father hopes for better, but a man must face truth when it is placed before him, and the truth was that they were not ready to carry the responsibility of her legacy. Perhaps one day they will learn. Perhaps humility will find them through the weight of their own choices. Until then, I am at peace with what I have done. The whispers of family have quieted now. Judgment has taken its course, and I no longer need to defend my actions. For the evidence is written in every document, sealed in every trust, living in every charitable act that will spring from the fortune my wife and I worked so hard to create. As I sit in the stillness of the evening, I hear the creak of the house around me, the same house where we dreamed and laughed and raised our son, and I find comfort in knowing that though she is gone, her presence endures in the choices I have made. I close my eyes and breathe deeply, and for the first time since she left this world, I feel that I have truly honored her, not with words carved on stone or flowers laid on a grave, but with decisions that protect the essence of who she was. This is my final word, my last testimony to the woman I loved and to the family we tried to build. Her kindness will live on through me. Her legacy will outlast the anger of those who tried to claim it, and when my own time comes, I will leave this world with the peace of knowing that I kept my promise. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.